Which of these Which state borders Ohio? Which state borders Mississippi? Which Which state borders Louisiana? Which state Wisconsin? Which state borders Ohio? Which state Alaska? Which state borders Alabama? Which state borders Tennessee? Which of these Which of these states is Which state borders Florida? Which Alabama? Which of these Which of these Which of these Which state borders Kentucky? Which state New Hampshire? Which of Which state Alabama? Which of these Which state share Nebraska? Which state borders Alaska? Which state shares New York? Which state borders Ohio? Which state shares New Hampshire? Which state borders Alabama? Which state borders Iowa? Which state shares North Dakota? Which of these Which state Wisconsin? Which state borders Tennessee? Which of these Which state borders Indiana? Which of these states Which state California? Which state borders the Pacific Oregon? Which of these Which state shares of New Mexico? Which of these Which state share Arkansas? Which of the Which state Georgia? Which of Which state shares Utah? Which state Minnesota? Which state borders the Missouri? Which state borders Washington?